going to be an overview lecture of Chapter 1 of the Openstax Psychology Textbook, 2nd edition. This chapter is called What is Psychology? I will do my best to fill in the slim outline here with stories and examples. This is a picture of a sculpture depicting a Greek myth, because a lot of psychology dates or extends back to the myths we told, and mythology, we could say, was predated the scientific practice of psychology. So what is psychology? Well, if we break the word down into its Greek roots, we have psyche, which is soul, and then ology, or logos, which means the spoken word, communication, or discourse in scientific inquiry. So ology is often used to describe the scientific study of something. So the scientific study of the soul in the 19th century, and then in the 20th century, scientists got a little squirrely about the word soul, and we started saying mind and behavior because scientists became agnostic. Newton, by the way, and his scientific contemporaries were very religious, so it wasn't unusual to talk about the study of the soul. But in the 20th century, most scientists became atheists. I would guess, and so now we have the scientific study of mind and behavior, and lots of other parts of human experience, which these chapters outline in detail. So there are a couple of schools in psychological inquiry, or in the history of psychology. The first is structuralism, and look at it this way. I'm thinking about like building blocks that we can use to build structures. Structuralists look at human being and human behavior and human thinking as assemblages of these structures. And so if we can understand the structures that make up personality, then we can understand personality. The structures that make up intelligence, we can understand intelligence. So it's looking down to the root kind of form. Wilhelm Wundt was the first structuralist, the first person to do experiments. I want to say he was working in Leipzig, but he was credited with having the first psychology experiment. He did some introspection, but he also did experimentation. He reproduced experiments. Today, structuralism looks like examining the nervous system and brain and going into what's actually happening in the body, looking at neurochemicals. At Wundt's time, when you couldn't look inside the body, we didn't have brain imaging software. It was looking at the way people thought. So people would describe their thinking process or their experiences, and he would look at the structure of consciousness through the kinds of descriptions they gave. William James did some of that as well, introspectionism that is, but he ended up kind of developing functionalism, another big school that continues today in psychology. Functionalists aren't worried about the structures that make up intelligence and memory and so on. They want to know why it happens, how it works, why it's important, and so they're looking at the function. So rather than looking at why intelligence happens or what the structures are that build up intelligence, William James and functionalists were interested in how intelligence is used. What's the function of intelligence? And we can understand it that way, more of a top-down strategy. Psychoanalytic theory developed with Sigmund Freud, who was a neurologist, which I'm always excited to share for some reason. He and his mentor, Breuer, worked with nervous disorders and found that talking to them actually helped make them better. These clients with nervous disorders, talking about it helped make them feel better. And he eventually developed this whole theory of talk therapy, which became psychoanalysis, or untangling the soul. And there's a whole pile of fields of psychology that extend from psychoanalytic theory. We'll get into that in a later chapter, I'm sure, so I'll leave it there. Gestalt psychology began with perception theory, recognizing that we understand what we see and feel and hear in these perceptual wholes that can only later be broken down into parts, kind of like a melody. We hear a bunch of notes and eventually, oh, it's a melody, and you know the melody, you recognize the melody, but you don't think about the melody in terms of all the individual parts, like the rhythm and the individual notes, for example. So Gestalt can be applied in perception, but also in clinical psychology. Behaviorism looks at humans in the in as simple a way as you can by looking at cause and effect, how the environment shapes the human's behavior, reinforcement and punishment, rewards, that sort of thing. Humanistic psychology kind of rejected behaviorism. They didn't want to just train humans to behave in a particular way. They wanted to acknowledge and accept the richest part of human being, like the unspeakable, ineffable parts of human being. Oh, and I didn't realize that we would be going through each of them. So now I guess I can check my work, see how well I did. Wilhelm Wundt is one of the founders of psychology. He had the first laboratory, and he used introspection, all of which I already described. Boy, it would have been helpful if I had been using these slides to give these descriptions. This is a bizarre portrait of William James without his full beard, which is the more common picture. Oh, and it was his own. William James, by the way, wanted to be an artist, but his dad didn't want him to be. The family looked down on it. His brother, Henry James, was a famous novelist in the history of American authors. William James wanted to be a painter. Here's him expressing his artistry. Ended up getting an MD from Harvard, which at the time was considered to be a free degree. I think times have changed since then. He's written many beautiful essays, by the way. A pleasure to read. And I've already defined functionalism. This definition, I think, leaves something to be desired. Here is Sigmund Freud. Look how serious he is. He, by the way, this I get secondhand from Fritz Perls, one of his distant students, or students once removed. He explained that Sigmund Freud had a social phobia and preferred to have meetings with the door closed. Or if you stop by his office, he would like talk to you through a crack in the door. So the whole process of the psychoanalyst sitting behind the client while the client talks to the wall may have simply been an artifact of Freud's social phobia. But one of his more famous books, A General Introduction to Psychoanalysis, talks about his whole theory of personality, the structure of the personality, development, slips of the tongue, and so on. Okay, I guess we've got psychoanalytic theory in more detail here. So Freud, like I said earlier, he worked with Breuer and developed talk therapy. They found that by talking to patients, their nervous symptoms got better, and so he believed he was doing psychic surgery, essentially. And he believed that you could train as a physician, as an MD, and then like specialize in psychoanalysis and then help people this way. He had his patients sit in a bed like this like Victorian chaise lounge, and then Freud or the analyst would sit back here. The patient would look this way while the analyst sat there and took notes. Again, Fritz Perls suspected this was because Freud had a social phobia, but it became one of the hallmarks of the practice of psychoanalytic theory, or psychoanalysis, the actual therapeutic approach. When people talk, just kind of talk and talk and talk, Freud believed that something was unleashed, something was loosed in the body, something repressed, something hidden, if they could keep talking without any sort of monitoring, without any defense, without anyone like choosing and picking what to share and what to hide. He believed that the person would get better because they would access some hidden part of themselves and resolve whatever problem they have been experiencing. It's way more complicated than that, but the gist of it is that. I personally like in his essay, the first essay that he shared, when he was sharing his theory. This was 1901. He talked about someone giving a speech or a lecture in a lecture hall, and then someone in the middle, like, who was drunk and like yelling obscenities at the speaker and people were complaining, and finally this drunkard got kicked out. That would be like the bit of the personality that gets dissociated and like thrown out into the hallway. And the task of psychoanalysis is to reintroduce the drunk person back into the lecture hall and make sure everyone kind of accepts them so that you can be whole again. I liked how Freud gave such simple examples, personable examples. Anyway, moving on to Gestalt psychology. This slide of, again, very serious looking white men were the Gestalt psychologists. So we've got Wolfgang Köhler, Kurt Kofka, and Max Wertheimer. Wertheimer was I've got a picture of him. Oh, no, it's down. I want to say the mustached guy is Wertheimer. But he was the first person to describe the principles of Gestalt perception. And I used to have a diagram somewhere in my office, but it's missing now too. The whole idea of Gestalt is the German word for whole, that we experience things as whole, undivided experiences or events, and then only later can break them down. So in order to understand what's happening, we need to look at the entire context and environment out of which it occurs. I am a Gestalt psychologist. I practice Gestalt therapy, dream analysis, and have written many articles on a Gestalt biologist by the name of Kurt Goldstein. You can look those up if you are interested. Now we're getting into behaviorism, which began in a laboratory, a physiology laboratory of a Russian by the name of Ivan Pavlov. It was later applied in psychology by Thorndike and Watson. And essentially, this is like the famous example. And if you're in my class, we're going to do a bunch of analysis practicing of the analytic procedure, breaking down the different parts of the environment and how they shape behavior. But what we see is how stimuli in the environment, such as food to a dog, creates or causes a behavior. So the environment shapes our behavior. And then depending on how that environmental stimuli is introduced, new stimuli can kind of be charged with that same power. So if I were to bake a cake, you were hungry and I brought it in, you would start to salivate. You can understand that pie as a stimulus that makes you salivate. Well, I could introduce other stimuli as well, where when you saw those, maybe it's like a tone or what I was wearing or the time of day, you would start salivating even though the pie wasn't there yet. But it was done with a bell and food, and eventually a hypothesis that Watson had that he could train any infant to be anything he wanted them to be, which he never succeeded in. But anyway, there's John Watson, famously fired from his university for having too many affairs with students. Evidently, he was an attractive guy. I don't know. I don't see it when I look at this picture. He had lots of hopes for what the science of behaviorism could become, wrote a lot of audacious books about it, had a successful or semi-successful academic career, but ended up being a footnote to the later B.F. Skinner, who was able to apply the theory of behaviorism in a much more compelling way. He could train rats and pigeons and dogs to do rather complicated behaviors by not manipulating the environment before a behavior, but manipulating the environment after the behavior. So by giving an animal something pleasing after they performed a target behavior, the animal was more likely to perform that target behavior. Again, if you're in my class, we're going to do a lot of analytic practice with operant conditioning, which is what B.F. Skinner did. What's the word for this? Chronologically, we are moving into the 50s and 60s with behaviorism, which focused on animals primarily. Some psychologists were disappointed that there wasn't very much emphasis on humans and how humans behave and what makes people human. So Abraham Maslow, among others, tried to examine what was unique about a human being and what it meant to become or to achieve your potential or to become human. And so he looked at among other things, the hierarchy of needs, which has been applied in a variety of ways, some good, some not so good. But this was one of the first models of motivation that wasn't simply, I will work for food behaviorism. So he looked at these very basic needs that grew up into, or that once met, you could move on to more sophisticated and human needs, the top of the pyramid of which is self-actualization or achieving flourishing, which I think many of us would like to achieve in our lives. So Maslow looked at people who had achieved that and tried to work back and understand what it meant to get there or how to get there. Carl Rogers was another humanistic psychologist. He worked as a therapist, and I was surprised to find that his three, so these unconditional positive regard, genuineness, or congruence, and empathy were the three key factors in successful therapy, Rogers believed. And I was surprised to find it in a counseling methods textbook published in 2023 in the first chapter as the three just general characteristics of a good therapist, without I think direct acknowledgement of those being Rogers' suggestions. Anyway, Rogers believed that if he trusted his clients and if he could be himself in a therapy relationship and if he could listen to the emotions being expressed and try to understand them, that he would be successful in therapy and he could help people grow. And that he didn't have to know anything else or give any advice or anything like that. Simply trust them, be himself, and empathize. I've tried to do the same thing in the classroom. You can read about that if you look for it. Maybe there's a few videos too. Then by the 50s as well, so at the same time as the humanistic revolution, there was a cognitive revolution. Behaviorists look at the body and behavior and the environment. Cognitive psychologists look at what's going on in the head or in the thinking process. Noam Chomsky was a famous representative of that. You can look at lots of interviews of him or like arguments with him, debates, I guess is the word for that, with him and others to kind of see where he's coming from. But the cognitive revolution was a huge change in the scientific practice of psychology. Behaviorists believed you couldn't measure what couldn't be seen, and cognitive psychologists demonstrated that that wasn't the case. We could measure things that were not directly observable by looking at you input information to a system or a person, and then look at what comes out, and you can assume that the transformation that occurred because of the structure of the mind or the thought process. Margaret Foy Washburn, I'm not very familiar with, other than that says there's the first woman to earn a doctorate in psychology. So I think this has been added as a gender recognition because the first 70 years of psychology was mostly absent women. I can say that women weren't allowed to be in the American Psychological Association until the 1920s. So think women's suffrage happened possibly before women were allowed to be members of the American Psychological Association. So there are several important women in the history of psychology, and I hope that these slides do acknowledge them. But just know that the history of psychology was mostly male-dominated, which means that there's a lot that a female perspective could yield, because a lot of the questions have been asked by men. Here is a very short list of the branches of psychology. Right now, there are around 60 divisions of the American Psychological Association. Among them are things like forensic, clinical, sports and exercise psychology, health psychology, and so on. Just know that there isn't one subdiscipline of psychology. There are a lot of different ways of looking. Just as an example, cognitive psychologists look at the mind, thinking, intelligence, and so on. Personality psychologists look at the structure of what makes a person different from other people and what the averages kind of are across people. Social psychologists look at how behavior changes in groups as opposed to being by themselves. Sports and exercise psychologists look at human potential in sport, and the interaction between exercise and mental health and well-being, and so on. Oh, and again, There's slides dedicated to each of these. I'm pretty sure there aren't like a million slides, so I'll go through these quickly. Just know that there are chapters dedicated to each of these. Biopsychologists look at the human body, in particular the nervous system. So here's like the peripheral nervous system and all those nerve cells and nervous tissue. And then the central nervous system here is just like the brain and spinal cord. And so a lot of contemporary research in biopsychology looks at the nervous system. And hence we have neuropsychology, but also things like neurochemicals, sleep, sensory and motor systems, muscular development, reproductive behavior, etc. Sensation and perception psychologists, really quickly, sensation is the ability to see, hear, feel, taste, smell, and so it's like the sense is like when that stimulus hits your body. It's like a light flashes on and all of those photons like smack against your retina. That's sensation. But to be able to say like, oh, someone just turned the flashlight on and is shining in my face, that's perception. See, we've just put that stimulus into a context and understood what's happening and what it meant. And so in my opinion, perception is way more important than just the stimuli, understanding the sensation that's happening. But it can be looked at either way. And the famous duck rabbit illusion, which I've toyed about getting this tattooed. I don't know. I'm not there yet. Developmental psychology, it's underlined here like it's misspelled. Oh, it looks like it's spelled correctly. The word check doesn't seem to be working. Oh, I doubted it again, but I double checked. Looks good. This is Jean Piaget, who was a French child psychologist and philosopher. He held a joint chair. It was a very rare position. That was at the L'École Normale Supérieure, which is like the school in France, in Paris. I was just showing off my knowledge there. Piaget studied cognitive development, as well as like the child's sense of time, child's sense of space. He wrote very interesting books. He spent a lot of time with children and really understood that children could accomplish tasks at different levels. And so he outlined 4 stages of cognitive development, famously. They've been well criticized since then, but they more or less stand as representative of what the big benchmarks are in cognitive psychology. The whole point here isn't to talk about Piaget, but that developmental psychologists look at the progression of people through various stages, including cognitive development, but also like emotional development, moral development, physical development. Personality psychologists, again, look at how personalities differ between people, or how people differ in terms of their personality. This is my favorite model of personality, which is the 5-factor model. There are 5 continua along which you can fall anywhere on the continuum between the 2 extremes. So for example, extroversion is probably the most well-known. Someone who's highly extroverted likes to be outgoing, they're social, they're energized by being around others. And then low on extroversion means you're introverted, you prefer to be by yourself, you're energized by alone time. So I would be closer to the introverted side. I sometimes enjoy being around people, but I'll get exhausted eventually, and I get really overwhelmed if there's a large group and they're all kind of demanding my interactive participation. So some people are energized by that and would be highly extroverted. I'm more on the introverted end. But there are 5 different areas with these continuums. And you can take a personality test to see where you land on each of them. And if you're in my class, you will. Here's an example of a social psychology experiment, and a couple of famous examples of those experiments, which include prejudice, romantic attraction, conflicts, obedience. Again, social psychologists looked at, and still look at, how the presence of others changes our behavior. So for example, the things that you would do while being supervised at work may be different than the things you do when not being supervised at work. Or if your boss asked you to do something that you would disagree with doing on your own, maybe the pressure of it coming from your boss might make you do it. And so some people have done horrible things throughout history, and social psychologists have tried to understand why and how that happened. Health psychology, to me, is one of the most exciting frontiers of psychology, and they try to help or try to understand the role or the influence of psychology on health and well-being, and the reverse. So how physical health can impact your mental health. So here we've got a Venn diagram with 3 circles, and you recognize the little overlapping areas, kind of suggesting that biology influences our social behavior. Social environment affects our psychology, and both of these affect biology, and so on. Lots of points of interaction. Lots of study to be done. This, by the way, is the biopsychosocial model of health and well-being, which is, oh, look at that, bam, written right there. Clinical psychologists are the therapists and psychiatrists and clinical psychologists and counseling psychologists and social workers and so on. Lots of names, lots of designations. Clinical psychologists try to understand psychological problems, mental disorders, psychopathology. They try to offer solutions and help. Mental health practitioners would fit into this category. This is a cognitive behavioral therapy model, recognizing that thoughts can influence emotions, and emotions can influence behaviors. Thoughts and emotions both influence behaviors. Behaviors influence thoughts and emotions. What typically happens is if you think you're overthinking, maybe that overthinking will make you feel frustrated, and that will lead to behaviors of frustration, which will lead to more overthinking, and you can get stuck in this loop. But just know that you can focus on changing your behaviors, you can focus on changing your thoughts, and that's where cognitive thoughts, behaviors, cognitive behavioral therapy focuses, so that we can change our emotions by changing our thoughts and behaviors. But that's just one model of clinical psychology. There are many. There are as many models of clinical psychology as there are chapters in this book. There are many more, actually, but at least as many as the chapters in the book. There are more areas of psychology, such as industrial organizational psychology, which looks at how productivity can be increased in the factory floor, but also in the white-collar businesses. So if you've ever attended a job training where you build rapport with your colleagues, then an organizational psychologist has designed that. I've already mentioned sports and exercise psychologists look at how psychology can be used to enhance performance, or how exercise can be used to increase mental well-being. Forensic psychologists work with criminal justice systems and the penal systems. Very popular topics since crime scene investigation became popular. I don't really know how much of forensic psychology is that crime scene investigation. There are many careers in psychology, and I would argue many more than you could list that have psychologist in the name. So if you're going into teaching, for example, I think psychology, a degree in psychology would benefit you tremendously to understand child development, for example. But there are some very specific areas you can go into, such as, oh, look, teaching right there. But I think they mean teaching as a college professor, teaching psychology. My sister-in-law is actually a corporate psychologist. She works in a corporation and has a master's degree in organizational psychology. Oh, this is a breakdown of where psychologists work. This is interesting for me. Okay, so the majority are in the university, more than 25%, then the hospital. So 51% are either in universities or hospitals, so applied psychologists. 16% in government or working at VA hospitals, so we could probably add that to the hospital sector. A few in not-for-profits, some are in medical school, or only 6% in private practice. Wow. So I guess most of the practitioners work for an established hospital or government. Interesting. These are the top psychology jobs for graduates. This is new. Interesting. Okay. Management, which isn't directly psychological. Sales, social work, etc. Human resources, personnel. healthcare. Until we get to 9. Interesting. It's worth knowing that only about 25% of people, 25% of American graduates, do something professionally that matches their major. So evidently psychology is a big one, of people going in to do different things that aren't psychology related. All right, well I've reached the final slide. I made it. Congratulations, you've made it with me. This is just a taste of what the entire book will supply. In terms of substance, it's all just like promissory notes on the chapters that should be coming, but evidently there'll be enough in there to be quizzed on. So I guess we'll have to look forward to see what those quiz questions look like. Thanks for joining me, and until next time.